Ever found yourself, kind of lost in thought about what brought down the mighty Roman Empire?
Yeah, it's a question that's captivated historians and really anyone who's ever cracked open a history book.
It's just one of those things, isn't it? And that's where our deep dive starts today. We're going deep with Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It was published right when America was getting started between 1776 and 1788. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
It does,
Yeah.
especially when you consider how much emphasis given places on liberty and civic virtue. Those are pretty big themes in America's founding story, too, right?
Exactly. So what we're going to try to do today is get to the heart of Gibbon's massive work. We're focusing on what he saw as the main reasons Rome went from this unstoppable force to,
Crumbling ruins.
yeah, exactly. And Gibbon's work is huge EE. It covers everything from the 2nd century AD to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But we're going to stick mostly to the first 3 volumes, the ones about the Western Roman Empire's initial decline.
That's where he lays out a lot of his core ideas. It's foundational stuff.
Right. And Gibbon wasn't just telling a story. He thought of himself as a philosopher historian, meaning he was digging through all those historical events to find the bigger lessons about politics and societies.
He was looking for those patterns that repeat themselves throughout history, the things that make or break civilizations.
Totally. And he was heavily influenced by this idea of civic humanism, which is basically that getting involved in public life and being, a good citizen. That's what makes a society work.
It's about more than just individual rights. It's about recognizing the duties and responsibilities that come with being part of a larger community.
Right. And guys like Machiavelli, Harrington, Montesquieu, they were big on this. And so was Gibbon. He put a huge value on liberty, saw it as the ultimate defense against tyranny and decay. So for Gibbon, Rome's decline is this cautionary tale,
Yeah.
a lesson in what happens when liberty is lost.
It's a story about how a society can become its own worst enemy.
Exactly. So let's rewind a bit. Gibbon saw the seeds of decline being planted way back in the late Roman Republic.
Even before Augustus and the official start of the empire.
Yeah. He pointed to things Rome's foreign conquests, they made the army massive. And the generals leading those armies, they had a ton of power.
Which, as you can imagine, led to some power struggles. Generals started throwing their weight around, trying to grab control.
Right. And all that wealth flowing back to Rome, Gibbon thought that corrupted the aristocracy. Instead of focusing on their civic duties, they were chasing pleasure and luxury.
It's like when you have so much wealth, it's easy to forget about the common good. You get caught up in your own little world.
Exactly. And then there's slavery. It was booming because of all those war captives. Huge estates popped up, worked by slaves. And the small independent farmers, they got squeezed out.
They either ended up joining the army just to survive, or they moved to the cities and became part of this growing mass of the urban poor.
Right. So you've got this growing gap between rich and poor. The old aristocracy isn't doing its duty. And ambitious generals see an opening.
They start appealing directly to the army and the masses. That's a recipe for instability, right?
Big time. It all leads to this cycle of factions, civil wars, dictatorships. And finally, in 27 BC, you've got Augustus taking over and boom, the republic's done.
The empire's born. And Augustus, he was actually pretty smart about it. He knew that too much expansion could be a problem, so he tried to limit it.
Right. But here's the thing. Gibbon argued that the next couple of centuries, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, the so-called Pax Romana.
That period of peace and prosperity that everyone talks about.
Yeah. Gibbon said that was actually a second phase of decline, even though things seemed good on the surface.
It's like that old saying, all that glitters is not gold.
Right. His point was that political liberty was basically gone. And that had a really slow but deeply damaging effect. It made people less willing to take initiative, and it eroded virtue.
It's like if you don't have a say in how your society's run, why bother being a good citizen? Why bother trying to make things better?
Yeah. Gibbon even quotes this observation from around 248 AD. He contrasts the virtue of the early republic, when things were tough, with the apparent prosperity and internal decline of the empire. He talks about how the Roman people had become this mass of servile provincials. They had the name Roman, but not the spirit.
They were living in the shell of a once great civilization, but the heart of it was gone.
Exactly. And then in the 3rd century, things start to really unravel. Civil wars, famines, barbarian invasions, it all hits at once.
Like all those cracks that had been forming beneath the surface finally burst open.
Exactly. And while the empire did manage a bit of a comeback under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, Gibbon argues that it came at a cost. More centralization, more bureaucracy, more taxes.
It's like putting a bandage on a deep wound. It might stop the bleeding for a while, but it doesn't actually heal anything.
And in the end, the Western Roman Empire just couldn't hold it together. You get this gradual impoverishment, depopulation, loss of territory, and then boom, around 479 AD, the barbarian king Odoacer takes over Rome.
The symbolic fall of Rome, although, of course, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, went on for another 1,000 years.
Right. But Gibbon's point is that it wasn't just one big event that brought Rome down. It was this long process of decline.
A slow unraveling of the fabric of society.
Exactly. And for Gibbon, the most important threads in that fabric were liberty and virtue. He argued that they were deeply intertwined. You lose one and you lose the other.
It's like a feedback loop. The loss of political freedom leads to a decline in private virtue, which further undermines freedom, and so on.
And he even says that the civil wars that ended the Republic were partly because the Roman nobility had become so corrupt, so focused on their own selfish interests, that they were incapable of a rational freedom.
They had lost the ability to govern themselves, to act in the best interests of the Republic.
Exactly. And without freedom, Gibbon argued, virtue can't really exist. Because virtue needs to be, like, actively practiced. It needs to be tested and challenged.
It's like a muscle.
Yeah.
If you don't use it, it atrophies.
Right. And Gibbon actually paints this picture of what he sees as the ideal society for freedom, one where power is balanced between the ruler, the aristocracy, and the common people. You know, independent farmers, artisans, traders, people who are contributing to society.
He's drawing on Machiavelli here, who also believed in the importance of a mixed constitution, with different groups balancing each other's power.
Right. And it wasn't just about, like, material poverty for Gibbon. It was about dependence. If you're reliant on handouts from the state or the wealthy, you lose your dignity, your freedom.
You become a subject, not a citizen.
Exactly. He thought a certain level of material simplicity, combined with economic independence, was actually good for virtue.
Because it encourages self-reliance, initiative, a sense of responsibility.
Right. And following on from Montesquieu, Gibbon also connected Rome's imperial expansion to its loss of liberty and virtue. He talked about how the early republic had citizen armies, but as Rome conquered more territory, those citizen armies were replaced by professional soldiers.
Soldiers who fought for pay, not for their homeland.
And Gibbon famously said that war was gradually improved into an art and degraded into a trade.
In other words, it became less about civic duty and more about personal ambition, profit.
Right. And these professional soldiers, they weren't tied to their communities the same way citizen soldiers were. They became tools for ambitious generals.
Guys like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, they all used their armies to grab power.
And even under the good emperors, the empire needed a large standing army. There was no going back to citizen militias.
The empire had become too big, too complex, too reliant on military force.
And so patriotism, that sense of duty that motivated the early Roman soldiers, it started to fade. Gibbon said they were replaced by honor and religion.
Honor, meaning like the pursuit of glory on the battlefield. And religion meaning, well, almost like a cult of the legion standards.
It's a golden eagle, right?
Exactly. And while that might not have been as noble as the old-school Roman patriotism, it was still more effective than the cowardice and love of comfort that Gibbon saw in the later Roman legions.
But in the end, this focus on military honor and, like, legionary religion, it just turned the army into a tool for despotism.
They ended up using their power against the very people they were supposed to protect.
And Gibbon even talks about how Roman military skill declined as they became more reliant on technology, on war machines. It's like they were compensating for a lack of individual valor.
Makes sense, right? If you've got a fancy machine that could do the fighting for you, why bother getting your own hands sturdy?
Right. And speaking of decline, let's talk about luxury. Gibbon often connects it to urban life, corruption, and the loss of virtue. But he's a bit more nuanced about it than that.
He recognized that luxury could have some positive effects, right? Like stimulating the economy.
Yeah. He even makes a distinction, kind of like Adam Smith, between good luxury and bad luxury. The good kind comes from industry, hard work, entrepreneurship. The bad kind comes from conquest, slavery, exploitation.
It's like if you're earning your wealth through honest means, that's one thing. But if you're getting it through, like, plunder and oppression, that's something else entirely.
Exactly. And Gibbon was pretty critical of the shameless and dissolute luxury he saw in the later Roman Empire. He thought it was a symptom of decline, not progress. People were focused on immediate gratification because they had lost hope for the
They
future.
were drowning their sorrows in luxury, essentially.
Right. Another thing Gibbon warns about is excessive centralization. He saw it as a major problem for Rome, when all the power is concentrated in the hands of the emperor and the bureaucracy.
And when there are no intermediary institutions, like a strong aristocracy or local assemblies, to check that power.
Exactly. And he points to Emperor Septimius Severus as a key figure in this process. Severus consolidated power, expanded the bureaucracy, basically ignored the Senate.
Gibbon was pretty critical of Severus, even though he acknowledged that Severus did some good things, like improving the administration of justice.
But for Gibbon, the loss of liberty was just too high a price to pay, and he's especially critical of the lawyers of that era. He saw them as like self-serving manipulators of the law, more interested in profit than justice.
They were more concerned with winning cases than upholding principles, basically.
And this centralization, it led to bigger bureaucracy, higher taxes. Gibbon talks about this one tax, the lustral contribution, that was especially hated.
It was a tax on, like, pretty much everything, and it was collected every 4 years. People dreaded it.
And these heavy taxes, they just made things worse. They discouraged work, they fueled corruption, and some Romans even started to think that life under the barbarians wouldn't be so bad.
Anything to escape the crushing burden of the Roman state.
Exactly. And then there were the social consequences. Gibbon thought that all the suppression and taxation led to a decline in the birth rate. People were too stressed, too poor to have kids.
He even mentions infanticide becoming more common. That's a pretty grim indicator of how bad things were.
Right, and this depopulation, it forced emperors to allow barbarians to settle within the empire, to serve in the army. Gibbon points out that this was a huge shift from the early republic, when citizens were eager to defend their homeland.
Back then, military service was seen as a duty and honor. But in the later empire, it was mostly about getting paid or avoiding punishment.
And Gibbon contrasts this with the motivations of the barbarians who actually loved fighting.
It was part of their culture, their way of life.
Right. And this reliance on barbarians is just further eroded Roman military skill and civic spirit.
The Romans were basically outsourcing their defense to foreigners who didn't share their values.
And it wasn't just the military that was in decline. Gibbon talks about a decline in culture, too. Art, architecture, literature, it all suffered.
He even describes how Emperor Constantine, when he was building Constantinople, had trouble finding good architects. He had to steal statues and stuff from Greece to decorate the city.
And Gibbon quotes this guy, Cedrenus, who said that Constantinople, despite all its fancy buildings, lacked the souls of the illustrious men those buildings were supposed to represent.
It's like a beautiful empty shell. No substance beneath the surface.
And Gibbon argues that this cultural decline actually started way back during the Pax Romana. He thought that the loss of liberty and individual initiative stifled creativity.
It's like when you're living under a stifling regime, you don't have the freedom to think new thoughts, to create new things.
Right. And Gibbon quotes Longinus, who compares the intellectuals of the later Roman Empire to pygmies, stunted by the chains of servitude.
A far cry from the intellectual giants of the ancient world.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating thing. Gibbon was actually pretty skeptical of the idea of a world state.
Even though the Roman Empire was like the closest thing the West had ever seen to a world state.
Yeah, he recognized that there were some benefits to it, but he thought the costs were just too high.
Because a world state would inevitably crush individual freedom. It would become too powerful, too centralized, too controlling.
Right, and he thought Rome's history proved his point. Even a vast, powerful empire like Rome wasn't immune to decline.
And Gibbon actually preferred the European balance of power system that existed in his own time. He thought the competition between states was a good thing. It prevented stagnation, forced countries to innovate.
And he even talks about how relatively peaceful Europe was in the 18th century, though I wonder what he'd say about the centuries that followed.
Yeah, the 19th and 20th centuries were pretty brutal.
But anyway, Gibbon's point is that a world state might sound good in theory, but in practice, it would be a nightmare for freedom.
A gilded cage, essentially.
Exactly. So to sum up, Gibbon saw a lot of reasons for Rome's decline, but he really emphasized the loss of freedom, virtue, and honor. He thought they were all interconnected, and they created this vicious cycle of decline.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, the whole system is collapsing.
Right. And he even suggests that if Rome had established representative assemblies earlier on, it might have survived.
Because those assemblies would have given people a voice, a stake in the system. They would have fostered a sense of civic responsibility.
But it was too little, too late. And in the end, Gibbon concludes with this, surprisingly optimistic take on the future of Europe. He says that because of advancements in science and technology, Europe is unlikely to suffer the same fate as Rome.
He thought human progress was basically inevitable.
But there's this tension in his work, right?
Yeah.
Because he spends all this time outlining how societies decline, and then he ends on this hopeful note.
It's like he wants to believe in progress, but he can't quite shake off the lessons of history.
And then you have someone like Jacob Burckhardt who comes along later and says, hold on, what about the barbarians within? He thought that even advanced societies could be destroyed by their own internal demons.
Using the very tools of progress for destructive ends.
Right. So what can we learn from all this?
Well, I think Gibbon's work gives us a lot to think about, especially in terms of international relations. He was a realist. He understood that war is a constant threat and that strength and preparedness are essential.
He wasn't a pacifist. He believed in the need for a strong military and a willingness to use it.
Right. But he also believed that military strength is ultimately rooted in civic virtue. A society that has lost its moral compass can't defend itself, no matter how big its army is.
Because it lacks the will to fight, the sense of shared purpose that's necessary for victory.
Exactly. And I think that's a really relevant message for America today. We can't take our freedom or our prosperity for granted. We have to actively cultivate the virtues that sustain them.
We have to be vigilant against the dangers of corruption, complacency, and excessive centralization.
Because ultimately, as Gibbon showed us, the fate of a nation rests not just on its material power, but on the character of its people.
So the question is, what kind of character are we building? What kind of future are we creating for ourselves?
Yeah.
It's something for all of us to think about. And maybe Gibbon's work can help us find some answers.
I think it can. Because by understanding the past, we can better navigate the present and shape the future.
Exactly. So what aspects of our modern society do you think Gibbon might have been worried about?
That's a good question. One that's worth pondering, and it's one that I think each listener needs to answer for themselves.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.